Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Ricky Hawks Jr., conqueror of both the RBT and BCBA exams. Today, I want to give you 5 tips on how I aced the BCBA exam on my first attempt. Let's jump into it. A recurring question that I receive is what materials did I use to pass the exam? A majority of the materials that I used were free because they were sent to me from friends and coworkers that had already taken the exam. Also, I joined ABA Facebook study groups and I utilized the free materials that were posted on there as well. But it's not so much what materials I used, but more how I utilized all of the materials for the BCBA exam. So today, I'll talk about what materials I used and the 5 tips that I can give you to pass the BCBA exam. So let's jump into some of my materials. We'll start with my SAFMED Flashcards. So I would use these flashcards. I used them in my graduate program across all of my courses, and I also used them when I was studying on my own. So SAFMED stands for Say All Fast, Minute Every Day, Shuffled. And we would be tested on these flashcards about every 3 or 4 weeks. And how they would test us is we would have to read one side, and we'll have to fill in the blank with the term that's on the other side. And what this did is over time, it built our fluency. So we should have been able to get a certain amount of cards correct in 1 minute. And so we'll find our baseline. We'll know how many cards we can get correct in 1 minute at the beginning of the course and towards the end of the course. If you started off with 12 in a minute, you should be up to like 16 or 17 because we're doing these things continuously throughout our course. And so I utilized these cards while I was studying as well. They were super helpful and they helped when I ran into questions where I was kind of stuck between 2 answer choices and I had to break down whatever the term was just to kind of see if it applied to the question. So these super helpful. So that's material number 1, SAFMED flashcards. Quizlet, personal favorite of mine. So as you can see with these flashcards, the SAFMED flashcards, these are more physical, on hand. I could just pull them out of my bag. With Quizlet, it was more digital, so it's easily accessible. It was on my phone. And so I'll just open up the app or I'll just pull it up on my computer and I'll use their website. And so how I would use Quizlet is I would cycle through the flashcards when I had downtime, or I would use like their testing feature on there to focus specifically on certain flashcards that I may be having some trouble with, or they had like games on there. I can kind of search up and look at other people's decks of flashcards to kind of see like how they're breaking certain terms down. Super helpful. Again, personal favorite of mine. Materials sent to me by coworkers, materials sent to me by friends, and then the materials that I found on ABA Facebook study groups. And so what I would do with those materials is I would download the PowerPoints, I would download the PDF files, I would download the cheat sheets, not literal cheat sheets that I could use on the test, but cheat sheets to kind of help with finding certain pages that kind of connect to a task list item on the task list. And so many materials that were available in those Facebook study groups. And I, again, receiving so many materials from friends and coworkers that had already taken the exam. And so I had a bunch of PDFs with just reading materials. And it was super helpful. I didn't have to search. I didn't have to search for these things. I didn't have to do a bunch of Google searches. I already had them in like a folder on my computer. Again, easily accessible. So yeah, reach out to people that you work with, reach out to friends that may have already taken the exam to kind of see what they have available and see what they'll let you use. And also go to Facebook, type in ABA study group, a bunch will pop up, join those groups. It's not hard to get into them, and you go to their file sections, ton of materials in there. So I utilize that as well. YouTube, as you can see, I'm here on YouTube now, but YouTube was a huge go-to for me. And so how I would utilize YouTube is I would give myself the weekends off. I would never study on the weekends, but on Sundays, I would kind of plan out what the week will look like, and whatever sections, task list items that I'm focusing on, I would search for the videos that connected to what I was studying, just so I wouldn't waste any time while I was studying. I would already have the video links in a document. I just click them, they'll pop up. The YouTube page that I watched the most was Sitecore. Really love his page, really love how he breaks everything down. And so I would have like multiple Sitecore links already in a document ready for me to access. So YouTube was a huge go-to for me. Podcasts. So the podcasts that I listen to now, if you follow my Instagram at Ricky the RBT, the podcasts that I listen to now weren't the podcasts that I listened to when I was studying. The only podcast that I listened to, it was called a Bad ASS Study Podcast. It was ABA Study Podcast. And she was super helpful. I don't know if she's still making episodes now, but maybe I'll put her link down in the description. But that's the only podcast that I would listen to. And I would listen to podcasts while I was in the gym because I wanted to continue to exercise just to keep the blood flowing, keep the blood circulating, and just continue to live a healthy lifestyle. And so outside of those podcasts, I would pull up YouTube videos. And so I would go to the Study Notes ABA channel, or I would go to ABA Exam Academy channel, and they would have Zoom lectures that they posted on their YouTube channels, and I would listen to those while I worked out. Cooper Book quizzes. So I did not know about these until about 2 or 3 months before I actually was about to sit for the exam, but they were super helpful as well. I can put the link for those in the description as well. But yeah, again, I didn't know a lot about them, so I didn't go through all of the chapters. But again, it was super helpful. When I would find time while I was studying and I wanted to answer some questions, I would pull up those. So Cooper Book quizzes as well. Again, I'll put the link down in the description. The BACB task list. So I know this one is like, why are you saying the BACB task list is one of your materials? Well, I pulled up that PDF daily. I always would have it on the screen just to refer back to, just so I can kind of look at the language and see how they're phrasing, like, okay, implement X, Y, and Z, discuss X, Y, and Z, describe X, Y, and Z. And so that's how I would study it, is I wanted to be able to implement it. How can I explain implementing it? How can I explain describing it? How can I discuss it? So on and so forth. I would just focus on the language that they were using, as opposed to just being able to just regurgitate the information, regurgitate the definitions. I wanted to be able to really explain it how they wanted it to be explained on the task list. So if you're looking at the task list, really pay attention to the language that they're using when they're describing how they want you to study these particular task list items. And last but not least, the ABA Wizard app, $9.99 in the App Store. So this is the only materials that I actually paid for. I wanted to be able to answer questions. I did not know about the Study Notes ABA app, where they have a similar feature where you can answer questions, and then they break it down similar to how the ABA Wizard app does. But I was familiar with the ABA Wizard app, and that was the only thing that I paid for. So that's how I was able to stay up under $10 to pass the BCBA exam. So those are the materials that I use. Let's jump into those 5 tips to pass the BCBA exam. So again, it really wasn't about what materials I use, but how I utilize those materials. And so with us jumping into the tips, the 5 tips that I'm going to give you, the 5 tips really focus on how I utilize the materials that I had to really put me in a position where I was most comfortable when I sat for the exam. And so tip number 1 is find your baseline. So I'm sure you've probably heard people mention it. Someone has probably said it to you, or you've probably read people who passed the exam where they kind of explain like what are some of the things that they did, and they mention they find their baseline. And what this means is you kind of figure out what level you're on before you actually start studying. So how you go about this is you have to find a mock exam. So how I went about it was a coworker of mine sent me a mock exam, and that's how I was able to find my baseline. I took that mock exam, I got my score back, and they broke each section down and they gave me a percentage. And so I looked at those percentages and I started ranking them, whatever sections I got the lowest percentage on, I ranked that number 1. What was the second lowest, I ranked that number 2, so on and so forth, until the last section that should be in that hierarchy should be your strongest section. That should be your strongest area. And so the reason why I put my weakest area at number 1 is because it's my weakest area, and that's where I'm going to focus all of my attention at. Also, when you get your score back from taking a mock exam, you now have a score, you have a percentage, and now you know the next time that you take a mock exam, if you got a 40% on this particular mock exam, then you want to get a 45%, 50%, 60%, so on and so forth. But you know exactly where you're starting at. Just for transparency purposes, the first mock exam that I took, I got a 59%. So if you got something similar to that, or you got something lower, you got something higher, don't feel bad. I started at 59%, And I wasn't upset when I got that 59%. It was more like a wake up call. Like, okay, I know exactly what sections I need to start with. And I believe that section was section J, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I started off, first mock exam I took, I got a 59%. Tip number 2, now that we know what area we're the weakest in, what section we're the weakest in, now it's time to pull out the Applied Behavior Analysis textbook, pull up any PDF files that we may have downloaded, any reader materials that we have, let's pull them out, and now it's time for us to read. And so we look at that, whatever section is our weakest, we look at the task list items that fall up under that section. And so if it's extinction, we open up a chapter for extinction in our Applied Behavior Analysis textbook. It's time for us to read. So as we're reading, we're taking notes. Or if you're not that type of person, then whatever works for you. But for me, I like to read, I like to take notes. And once I'm done reading and taking my notes, I go give myself like a 10-minute break, go for a walk, let the blood circulate, let my mind ease a little bit, maybe watch a quick show or something like that. Then I go back, and when I go back, now it's time for me to watch a video. And the purpose of me watching those videos was to kind of make sure that I was on the right track, to make sure that how I was understanding it is exactly how someone else would be explaining it. And so again, I watched a lot of Sitecore videos, and he broke things down so well that I was blown away, and I was just like, this is perfect. And so it was times where how I was understanding it connected with how he was explaining it. There was other times where I had to take additional notes. But that's the purpose of me reading one, but also watching those videos after I read and take notes. So that's tip number 2, read. So now that we've read, now it's time for us to go into tip number 3, and that is to connect the dots. So what does that mean, connect the dots? What I mean by connect the dots is let's piece information together. And so how I would go about connecting the dots is after I read, I took notes, I watched videos, I would dedicate some time to creating my own examples. And so whatever I focused on in my study session, I would create a fake client, and I would give that client fake details, and whatever I learned, I would try to apply it and develop some type of intervention package. And so when I would do that, I would find myself creating concept maps. I would find myself creating flow charts, maybe developing some acronyms. These are all things you can do to kind of help connect the dots. But when I made that fake client and developed that intervention package, sometimes I would pull from different sections or different past study sessions where I discuss like differential reinforcement. And I'm like, oh, you know what? Since I'm trying to extinguish this particular behavior, I could utilize this differential reinforcement procedure to kind of help with extinguishing this particular behavior. And at that point, I'm piecing information together, and that's helping me connect the dots and showing me that all these things kind of connect. I may incorporate a 3-term contingency, and now I'm breaking down a 3-term contingency, so on and so forth. But I took time to, again, connect those dots and create my own examples. That was super helpful for me. And so that is tip number 3, take some time to connect the dots. Tip number 4, utilizing apps like the Study Notes ABA app or the ABA Wizard app. Apps where you can answer questions, or you can utilize Cooper Book quizzes. You just need to be able to answer some questions, right? So you've taken time to read, take notes, watch videos. You've taken some time to create your own examples. Now let's apply what we've learned to some questions, some mock questions. And so what I would do is I would spend a little time just sitting there, just answering questions. And I would set a criteria that tells me when I can move to the next section. So that criteria for me was I wanted to be able to answer all 10 questions in one sitting before I move to the next task list item. And if you have the apps, then you have an idea of what I'm talking about. But for each task list section, you can go to a task list section, and then you have all the task list items. You click on the task list item, and you have access to 10 questions that pertain to that particular task list item. And so I wanted to answer all 10 of those questions before I move to the next task list item. And so what will happen is, even if you get a question wrong, you can just move to the next one. And so what I would do is, if I got a question wrong, then I would just go back to the first question. They never changed the question, so I was just kind of memorizing after a while, but that was the contingency that I put into place for myself, is I wanted to get the question correct the first time and not have to go back. And so I would have to sit there and really analyze those questions just to make sure that I don't have to start over. Because sometimes what will happen is I would get to question number 9 and I know, or I get question number 10 and I know, if I get this question wrong, I literally have to go back to question number 1. So I need to make sure that I get this question correct so I can move to the next task list item. And so that was super helpful. I used those apps. I used the ABA Wizard app on the go. I used it while sitting. I used it during downtime. And so what happened when I was studying is, if anyone knew me while I was studying, I was basically studying for like 12 hours straight. I would wake up, go to the gym, doing something exam related. I'm listening to a podcast. I'm listening to this, listening to that. I go to work, working with my clients. But when I had downtime, I'm answering questions or I'm flipping through flashcards, right? Or if I'm actually sitting and I'm actively studying, then I'm actively studying. So it was like 12-hour periods where I was actively studying. And so I'm using these apps on the go. Now, with the app, I learned a trick from a friend of mine that took the MCAT. And what he told me was, it's one thing to just answer those questions and you get the question correct and you move on. But it's another thing to explain to yourself why that particular answer applied to the question. And so what he explained to me was, when you get a question wrong, explain to yourself why that particular answer choice does not apply to that particular question. Super helpful for me, because now this dialogue amongst myself to really explain to myself, okay, negative reinforcement didn't apply to this particular question because blah, 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 blah. But positive reinforcement applied because blah, 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 blah. And it may be times where I have to pull out my reading materials just to get more information so I can help myself understand what it is or why this particular answer choice didn't apply. And it's the same when I got the questions correct. Is I would explain to myself, okay, positive reinforcement applied to this question because blah, 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 blah. Super helpful. Again, having that dialogue in a less stressful condition was so beneficial, because when I actually sat for the exam, I had that same dialogue. You'll run into questions where you're gonna have two answer choices that seem so correct, and you have to be able to explain to yourself, like, okay, this one applies because blah, 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 and this one applies because blah, 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 blah. But those little small details, at that point, that's where we're having that dialogue, like, okay, this is what differentiates the two. And so this one applies but doing it in a less stressful condition is super helpful, because I'm able to practice, and there's no time constraint on how long I'm sitting here explaining this to myself. So with this was super helpful. It helped enhance my knowledge on the particular terms and concepts. And again, with me having that dialogue in a less stressful condition, I had that same dialogue. It was a lot quicker in the exam, but I was able to practice it in a less stressful condition. And again, really deepening your knowledge for the different terms and concepts, because you're explaining to yourself, this particular answer choice applies because, this particular answer choice does not apply because. And if you don't know, then that's an opportunity for you to open up your book, open up your reading materials, or you can just ask someone. You can get someone on the phone, or if you're at work, you can kind of ask around just to get other people's opinions, just to kind of help you further understand and deepen your knowledge for whatever you may be having some trouble with in that moment. So that's tip number 4, utilizing apps like the ABA Wizard app or the Study Notes ABA app. You need apps where you can answer questions. Tip number 5, I feel like this tip right here helped me the most when it was time for me to sit for the exam, and it's just general recall. Just recalling the information that you acquired during a study session, or you've acquired 2 or 3 study sessions ago, or you acquired a week ago. Just making sure that you're able to recall the information without looking at your notes. And so what I would do is, after I finished studying, I sat down and I've studied for an hour or 2 hours. After I finished, I would open up a notebook, I would set a 10-minute timer, and I would just write out everything that I remembered from that study session. No notes, no anything. Everything is closed and shut down. I'm just writing out everything that I can remember, just sheer brain power, right? And after I wrote out everything, I would reread it. But while I was rereading it, I made sure that I used a voice recording app on my phone so I can record what I'm saying, but also I can catch any extra dialogue, right? Any comments, any questions, any light bulb moments, it was a lot of light bulb moments when I would reread, and I would find myself like rereading this, like, oh, we're talking about positive reinforcement, but oh, that connects to blah blah blah, or we're talking about rate, and that connects to. But I'm able to catch all these light bulb moments, and I'm recording it. And when I would re-listen to it, I would re-listen to it in the gym, re-listen to it on the go, re-listen to it before my next study session, just to kind of recall what I had learned in the previous session. Something else that I would do is when I would sit with my supervisor, we would have conversations about what I had been learning. And so he'll ask me like, hey, 2 days ago, what were you studying? And I'll tell him I was studying, I don't know, graphs or something. I was studying line graphs, and he would say, okay, talk to me about line graphs. And I would have to talk about line graphs, and no notes, no anything, just talk about line graphs. And again, me being able to recall this information without looking at my notes, again, super helpful. And you'll find yourself in the same situation where you're actually sitting for the exam, and you have to look at the answer choice, and you have to recall information, as much information as you can, but you're practicing it in a less stressful condition. And so I would talk to my supervisor, and he would give me information that I may have missed. He would reassure me, give me some things to consider, so on and so forth. But again, just recalling the information from the previous study session, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, just bringing that information back to the forefront of your brain, because you're going to have to do it when you sit for the exam as well. So those are my 5 tips to ace the BCBA exam. If you wrote down any notes during this video, please leave me a thumbs up. If you found this video super helpful, you found this video helpful just in general, please subscribe, turn on that notification bell so you're notified when I post my next video. Also, if you guys have any tips and tricks for studying, please leave them in the comments. Someone will benefit from them, and I would enjoy reading them as well. Thank you guys for stopping and watching this video. Catch you all on my next one. I'm out. Peace.